Discover your inner goddess and live up to your highest value and most abundant potential. Welcome to Grateful Goddesses, a podcast that empowers you to unleash your inner goddess and take the leap of faith to live your best life. Your guide, Karen Pulver, joins her fellow goddesses in soulful conversations about gratitude, personal growth, authentic living, and a bevy of topics affecting women today. Let's start the show with your host, Karen Pulver.
Welcome, everyone, to Grateful Goddesses. I'd like to start off with a quote. Perhaps strength doesn't reside in never having been broken, but in the courage required to grow strong in the broken places. So what is this courage? For me, when I think about courage, I always think about the lion in The Wizard of Oz and how he struggled to get courage and how he thought that the wizard would give him courage. But in the end, he had the courage in him all along. Well, I believe as goddesses, we have that inner goddess courage inside us all along. But how do we get there? How do we discover this courage? So we all have fears, we all have anxieties, we all have vulnerabilities, and we need courage to get past those fears, plus a lot of other support. So today we're going to be talking with our guest, Peggy Hough, who is a licensed clinical professional counselor of over 25 years. She's a certified alcohol and other addiction counselor. She specializes in the treatment of addictive disorders and trauma. She's also an NLP master's level clinician, which is a neuro-linguistic programming that is with an approach to communication, personal development, and psychotherapy. She's also a polyvagal informed therapist. And Peggy's work, with her work, she strives to help others to attain a better understanding of themselves and their goals and values, to develop skills for improving their relationships, for finding resolution to issues or concerns that lead them to seek their therapy, learning new ways to cope with stress and anxiety, managing anger, grief, depression, and other emotional pressures, among with many other benefits when you work with Peggy. So welcome, Peggy. Come join us today on Grateful Goddesses.
Thank you,
Hi.
Karen. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor that you thought to even invite me. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I love your energy. I love your wisdom. And your quote that's on your website about courage, like I thought about that lion and about how he had the courage all along. And I was wondering about your thoughts about fears, anxiety, vulnerability. For me personally, when I was younger, I was always afraid of the monster under my bed. Always afraid. And I'd kind of take that little peek and there was no monster. And then it was okay. But as I got older, I was okay with things. Things were, manageable. But about 10 years ago, I had a cancer diagnosis and my whole world turned upside down. And no matter how much I tried, subconsciously, I was afraid. I'd have panic attacks. I'd have anxiety getting into elevators, closed, confined places. And I did go to therapy, a different kind of therapy, a cognitive behavioral therapy. Mm-hmm. And I learned how to take that fear and bring it close to me and hold it. But I still struggle every now and then with that feeling of anxiety, especially now with COVID. We're not here for a session of therapy that you're going to fix it in one thing. But I'd love to know your thoughts about how therapy can help someone like me that's dealing with these kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, I do appreciate your vulnerability. And that is really where therapy starts, right? That we have to acknowledge that there is something going on internally that we feel either incapable of managing or overwhelmed by it. Which I guess in essence would be the same thing, right? It just feels like it's too much at certain times. And you were talking about the layers of things in your own life personally, like illness. Cancer diagnosis is very threatening and very scary. You mentioned in your introduction of me that I am a polyvagal informed therapist. And that work, for those who are not familiar with it, grew out of the work of somatic experiencing, which I am also trained in. That's Peter Levine's work. The polyvagal theory, more specifically, has to do with our autonomic nervous system. And the reason that I bring it up right out of the gate in the beginning
Mhm.
is because it's so important for us to befriend our nervous systems. Most of us tend to look outward for something when we are fearful. We might engage in some kind of addictive behavior, whether it's substance abuse, sexual acting out, overspending, overeating, whatever it is. We look to something external to make our internal selves better. And really, where the work begins is to notice the fear, notice the anxiety, and befriend it. Understand like what our bodies are trying to tell us. I work primarily from a systems perspective, which means essentially we are all part of a system, right? Whether it's our immediate family, our extended family, our workplace. So our energies bounce off of each other, right? We're constantly kind of co-regulating or being influenced by each other's energy, right?
Mhm.
And again, we culturally live in a place where, in a culture where we are constantly looking to externals to feel better internally. I think what we have missed along the way is this notion of really familiarizing ourselves with our own internal nervous systems because our body has all the answers for us. Our nervous system picks up on cues of danger, cues of threat, cues of safety. And our minds and brains are going to respond accordingly.
Mhm.
So the first step, I believe, a very long-winded answer to your good question, is to notice the fear, notice the anxiety, notice how do I know how I feel anxious or fearful? Where in my body do I feel
That
that?
I know. That I know. My heart
Yeah,
races, I get sweaty.
exactly.
I've even been driving and I've had to pull off to the side of the road. It's like comes on suddenly, for
Right,
sure.
right. But that is the first step of
Right.
befriending it, right? And when I
Uh-huh.
say befriend it, I use that language intentionally because our feelings are not good or bad, right? They just
Right.
are there. We just have to like notice them, get curious about them is how I like to talk about it with people. And understand like what's going on, what is my body trying to tell me? Where in my body do I feel this?
Right.
If it's anxiety, for example, like you said, your heart races, right? For some
Mhm.
people, it's kind of they describe it as almost a, tightening of like you're squeezing a rag, like
Mhm.
it just feels tighter and tighter in your chest or your stomach or whatever. And then really, try to like unsqueeze that rag, if you will. So you give it an image, you notice where it is in your body, you get curious about it, and you do something to bring some what's in polyvagal theory called ventral energy, but it's social engagement, it's calm, it's connection, and that's what we're all wired for. What I think is important also is you mentioned that sometimes you were taught to hold it, right? To not push it away, but to
Like a
hold it.
baby. Like a baby.
Right, right. But sometimes when you do that, you also
Yeah.
talked about the fact that it can feel overwhelming and it kind of
Yes.
backfires on you, if you will. And it's
Exactly.
kind of like so much for this, holding it. I'm, feeling more overwhelmed now.
Right.
That's exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about befriending and understanding your nervous system.
Hmm.
Because those cues of overwhelm are cues of this is too much. I need to notice it. I can be curious about it, know it's there, but I need to bring some calming energy to it also. Or I want to, or sometimes we need to just bring some different energy to it once we notice it's getting overwhelming. I like to talk to people about it, the same adults, the same way I talk to kids about it, which
Right.
is if it feels overwhelming, it's okay to just notice it, put it on the bookshelf, and say, I'll come back to you,
Right.
when I feel like I can kind of embrace it a little bit longer. So you give yourself the space to kind of notice it, sit with it, but then you can put it down and,
See, I've
bring
never
different
been told
energy
to
in.
put it down. Not that I'm not putting down
Right,
other therapists, but I've been told to bring it closer and closer. And I feel like that's such a good point, because thinking about recognizing it, acknowledging it, but then calming yourself from it, taking a space back, taking a
right.
step back. That makes
Right.
sense.
It's kind of, if I were to compare it to what most of us are living with today,
Yeah.
not only the coronavirus, but now, the rioting and the protests that are turning violent. And
Hmm.
it's kind of like I can watch the news for a little bit because I want to know, I want to be informed, but then it really is too much for my nervous system. So I have to turn it off.
Oh, I
And
hear you.
it's
I
it's an
know.
analogy that I think helps people to understand that it's okay to kind of titrate in and out of that kind of,
Right.
energize that is feels anxious and overwhelming.
It's okay to say no. It's okay to take a step back.
Exactly.
But people are afraid to be vulnerable. And I know Alyssa has a question for you about
Hmm.
vulnerability.
Hi, Alyssa.
Yes,
Nice to see you.
nice to see you. I do have a question about vulnerability. I know, and I've read a lot, and I've heard a lot of people speak about vulnerability being requiring courage and risk taking, and how they all sort of go hand in hand. But some people, myself included, have a hard time breaking out of their comfort zones. And I'm just wondering, like, what do you tell people who are generally risk averse? They have a difficult time making big life moves, even if those big life moves might be what they really need or really want. They're trying sort of to kind of hone in on that vulnerability, but that's sometimes easier said than done. So
Right.
um,
Right.
just curious, what do you tell people who find themselves in that situation?
It's an interesting question about like when you need it or want it, right? The conversation about the vulnerability would start with a acknowledgement that culturally we do not live in a culture or society, especially women, where vulnerability is encouraged, right?
Right.
We are, to use a common phrase, if men are, vulnerable, they're like, wow, these gentle giants,
Yeah.
If women are vulnerable, they're crybabies, they're weak. So, for starters, we are all living in a culture that does not foster vulnerability. And vulnerability, from my perspective, is really about emotional exposure, right? I mean, it's fear. It's, what if I do this and I do it wrong? Or what if I make this decision and it's not the right decision? One of the things that I love to remind people of, and again, not something that culturally is well ingrained or neatly woven in concept, is that there is really no such thing as failure. It's all just feedback. And if we can approach any decision making that is difficult from that perspective, that, what? The reality is, maybe I do know that this is absolutely what I need to do. It's what I want to do. But maybe I'm going to find out in 3 months or six
Mm.
months that, wow, what seemed like the absolute thing I needed to do is not right. So I try to help people to understand that to be vulnerable and take those kinds of risks and make decisions that are kind of, filled with ambiguity or ambivalence, it's not always going to work out, right? But it's taking the step because what we're telling ourselves is we want or we need this. With respect to your specific question about, well, what if somebody just kind of gets stuck and they just can't move out of that place of fear? Then the vulnerability conversation gets a little bit deeper in terms of, what's the story you're telling yourself about this? What are you telling yourself is going to happen if I do A and expect B to happen, but uh-oh, C or D happens? What do you tell yourself about that? And usually if people can walk through it, and begin to really have a sense of what stories their nervous state is telling them about the decision process, then they can kind of step back from it and say, oh, yeah, you know what? Maybe it's not going to be the right decision. I mean, I don't know of any of us that can say with confidence that every hard decision we've made has been the right decision,
Right.
or a good decision, right? So it's really about, in that regard, kind of embracing the emotional exposure and knowing that, you're going to get feedback regardless of what the outcome is. It's going to be a teacher, the experience itself.
So one example of a story you might tell yourself that's, kind of stalling you or paralyzing you from moving on is, well, I'm afraid that if I do A, expecting B, but C happens, I'm going to be really embarrassed or something because
Yeah.
I've told
Mhm.
everybody that I was going to do, that I was going to get to B, but I got to C. Right. And if
Right.
that's your story, which is like, okay, well, okay, so we can all live with it. Once you realize that that's what's keeping you right from doing it, is you might be a little embarrassed that you didn't get there or you failed, or then
Right.
I think that's what you're saying is an example of like a story that you're telling yourself. Is that right?
Right. The story that we tell ourselves is usually what trips us up the most, right?
Mhm.
Because the other thing that I often do with people in these kinds of situations is, what would you tell your best friend about this
Mm.
process that you're going through? And bring that same compassion to yourself, because we often don't do that. We oftentimes have a much greater capacity to be compassionate, understanding, and supportive of others, but we don't always bring those same, qualities to our own situations. And really leaning into the discomfort and knowing,
So
what,
hard.
maybe this is going to be a colossal failure, and I've told all of my friends, not just my inner circle of friends, but like, I'm moving to another country and I might be back in 6 months, or
Yeah.
whatever the exposure is, right? The exposure is what happens if it doesn't go the way I expect it to go. And my answer is always, then tell me what you learned from that. What do you gain from this experience? What's the feedback? How do you use this to move forward and bring that same compassion that you would to somebody else, to a friend? Does
It's
that
true.
answer your question?
It does totally, and I love the thought about sort of what would you tell a friend. I think that's,
Me
if you
too.
just
Right.
sort of tell yourself that or think through that
Because we put
in that
ourselves
way.
down so much and like
Yeah.
we're like, oh
Right.
shit, that didn't work. Oh my God, that
Right.
didn't work. Even with Peggy, this Grateful Goddess journey on a podcast, I'm feeling so vulnerable about
Sure.
I just told whoever's listening about my couples therapy that not everyone
Exactly.
will talk about, but
Right.
I'm being very vulnerable because I want to help people. And I learned so much from you, and I'm hoping others
Well, thank you.
will as well. Thank
Thank
you,
you. I
Alyssa.
appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Peggy.
Thank
So
you, Alyssa.
Dina has some questions about what's going on with COVID today. And when this podcast does air, we're hoping that people will be back at work. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter, even if, we're still dealing with other things in our lives, especially with what's going on right now. Dina, would you like to join
Right.
us?
Hi, Dina. Nice to
So,
see you.
you too. Thank you so much for being here. So, I don't seem to get that anxious by obsessing on the news. I mean, when the pandemic happened, I knew there was a time after the week or two I had to take a break and I'd watch it once a day. The
Mm-hmm.
last 4 days, I have been glued to CNN about, I mean, I have friends in New York, I have friends in LA, I have friends everywhere, and they're all in these major cities with all of this happening. And
Yeah.
I don't know what to say to my kids. I don't know how to make good of it or see that or do any of it. I'm just really, really saddened by all of it.
No, we all need
Right.
help with that. What do you think, Peggy?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that in some ways my response would be the same to both of those questions, right? Whether it's the pandemic or the rioting. And this is such a universal experience in our country right now. And we're all experiencing it. It's kind of like, even as a therapist, like, people are coming to me talking about their fears of the pandemic. I'm in a very vulnerable age group. I have those same fears, right? And I can't pretend that I don't, nor would I think it would be, wise to do that. So I think the same thing applies here. And now layer on top of that, all of this violence and injustice really is what started all of this. I think the conversation has to be first about affirming their fears and also about, I too am afraid. I think that as parents, our tendency is to protect our kids from those kinds of fears. My response really is, I think what we have to do first is affirm how our kids are feeling, answer their questions openly. I've talked to many parents over the last several days. It's a very painful time. It's difficult to hold this space with people, especially people of color or other marginalized groups. Every time there's one of these incidences, it just kind of, in a very kind of waves of PTSD, they
Yeah.
surge, and it's just all comes back. And this is not new, centuries old, and we want to believe that we're doing better, and yet it's hard to talk about the remedies because they're not there. And politically, we're probably in a much more frightening space than we've ever been, in my opinion. So there's a lot coming at kids. There's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of prejudice, there's a lot of racism, veiled as it might be. I think first and foremost, it's be open to having those very difficult conversations about your fears, about the ways that you want to protect them. It's very real, and it's in everybody's faces. I don't know how old your children are, but most children have access to television or phones or iPads, or we're just inundated with these images. There's no escaping it. So to be able to talk to them about, we want to limit our exposure while we're taking this all in, so that it's not so overwhelming, but that your fears are very real. I don't think you have to pretend to have answers. And really, that's a disservice to our children, no matter how old they are. Obviously, the conversation we have, we want it to be age appropriate, right? And to, really help them understand. And for much younger children, it's important to limit their exposure, even more so than older kids. And we as individuals can start to make change. That's what this is really about. All of this protesting that unfortunately has turned into violence in many areas is the demand for change. So, what are some ways that we as individuals can begin to look at this, not so much as this is what's happening to people of color or other marginalized groups, but this is what's happening to our neighbors. This is what's happening to our communities. This is really what is happening to all of us. So, what are some steps that we as individuals can begin to take to affect some change? And that's a long process and an arduous process.
So actually last night, as we're all in the house together, and I said to my husband, I feel like we need to, I don't have any of the expertise that Peggy does, and I hope it wasn't terribly detrimental, but like, we sat down and we watched CNN and we had a conversation. And to your point, Karen, all three of my kids were doing and have been activists in ways that I didn't realize they were doing. It was actually me who needed the education.
That's right.
But I'm not looking at this white privilege as something that it isn't, and being a voice for those that aren't of white privilege, right? And my kids were doing that already in their day-to-day lives. Like, I was a little bit relieved to see that they're actually growing up in this world, that they're actually being this participant for this change. They're young, they're not there yet. They can't be on those, they're
Right.
a little bit behind. But I was relieved to think that they not all of them, my littlest one was a little bit confused, because she's like, the police have, she was confused, but that was appropriate. But they were involved. They were involved naturally with their friend groups,
Right.
or organizations that they're in, or the charitable work that they do, or service work. So which I felt was somewhat my job. I wanted to make sure that I was putting kids out into this world that could make change. Because
But you're affirming their feelings. You were
yeah,
affirming just like you were
Exactly.
doing that.
but they weren't coming to
Right.
me. I put it in front of them. I was like, we got to talk about
That's
this.
great.
What's going
Right.
on?
I'm glad you raised the issue of how confusing it was too, especially for the younger ones, because it is confusing. Police are supposed to be people that protect us. So this is like so many other arenas in our lives where people that are supposed to be protecting us, whether they're policemen, priests, politicians, whomever, and then violate that trust. It's clearly not everyone in those categories, right? So
Right.
that's what gets confusing as to especially younger children. And that's a good conversation to have with them is that because this policeman and the three others that were with him did this horrific thing does not make all policemen bad. And it is confusing for kids because they're like, police, like we're supposed to be safe around them. They're supposed to be, keeping our communities safe. So to answer the questions about the confusion and notice that, yeah, you know what, it is confusing, affirming it. I'm confused by this sometimes too. I think affirming kids, expressions and, digging in a little deeper with them. So what happens when you feel confused, and invite them to talk about those things. Then I think that you did, exactly the right thing is we're going to watch this together so that we can talk about what we're seeing so that we can understand what's going on in our world. And, we will kind of try to sort out all this confusion together.
Thank you.
Right. So Rachel, come join us. I know you have some questions too about vulnerability and fear.
Hi,
Rachel.
Rachel.
Peggy. Hi. Nice to see you.
You too.
So, in this time of Corona, when you're outside, people have their mask on, they have sunglasses on, they have hats on, and there's like, this fear of engagement at all. Like you don't want anyone's, breath
Right.
to be on you. But I feel like the reality is people have been incredibly shut off long before Corona happened. I mean, people are on their phones all the time in public. No one's looking around. No one's engaging. I have a dog. People don't even make eye contact, as you're walking down the sidewalk. And I happen to be someone who says hello to every single person I see, whether they're looking at me, whether they have
Me too.
headphones. I just like to connect. I'm happy to be that person in life. But I am so scared of people never engaging again. And I'm just wondering what you would say, like as a population, a community, a culture of what is the importance of engagement? What would you say to like get people to re-engage again and care about their community, their neighbors, their just strangers around them? What advice do you have for people?
It's interesting because I would answer that question a little bit differently now in the middle of a pandemic than I would otherwise. But in general, connection is a biological imperative. We are wired for connection. It's what we want as humans. What happens to our nervous systems when we are getting all these cues of threat and danger is that we go into a more sympathetic state, which is a more kind of fight or flight state. And when we are in that state, we are now primarily wired for protection, not connection. It's when we're in a state, what is in polyvagal theory called ventral, which is safety and social engagement, then our priority is connection. But as soon as our nervous system picks up cues of threat or danger, like collectively a lot of people's nervous systems are picking up on right now, the priority is protection. So when you talk about you don't want to have that person sneeze on you, or you're going to move 12 feet this way when somebody comes walking toward you, I think that in this time and space, that's probably an appropriate response, right?
Mhm.
But I do believe I am somebody like yourself. I say hello to everybody I pass, whether I have a mask on or I don't. I tell the person at the checkout that I'm actually smiling at you and thank you for working. I think that it comes down to, as individuals, as we start, and when that re-entry does start, which none of us know for sure when that's going to be, that we really respect that this is going to be a different experience for each of us, right? So I think, as far as your fear of people never, wanting to re-engage, I think, if anything, one of the silver linings in this may be that it really helps people to get re-engaged, in terms of, to your point, Rachel, before this all happened, people were on their cell phones, they were on screens of some kind and not engaging. Even, I mean, I would go to a restaurant and see a family and everybody's on some
Right.
different, screen, which
That may have
is
been my family.
right. But it is the
It's true.
case. And I think what it comes down to, whether it's re-entering from this pandemic or just in general, is each one of us having to make a conscious decision that, wow, we have lived in such a fast-paced world where we don't even look at each other when we're passing, let alone say hello or smile. Everybody's on, their path to the next thing that has to get done. In some ways, the kind of imposed slowdown that the pandemic has resulted in, for some people, not everybody, it begins to allow people to understand they don't have to move at that pace. We don't need all those things we thought we needed. We don't have to go right from our office to Target or to whatever. That we can slow down. And my hope is that collectively there is a slowing down. But what we have to also understand is that in the midst of this reentry is also this eagerness to get back to work, to get the economy back flowing. And so people might rush into things at a quicker clip. But in general, I think it really does come down to, how are we each going to handle reentry? How are we going to, what is the energy we want to bring to it? Because the other thing that happens between you and me, between Karen and me, between the three of us, is our nervous systems are always co-regulating, right? Like, we can bring some of that connecting energy just by simply saying, I know this is scary, or this might feel a little awkward. I'm not sure how I should handle, like, walking past you in the hallway, or whatever it is. It's naming it, instead of trying to guess at what other people are thinking, because this is all new to everybody.
It's kind of been a fear of mine for a while, just in society. And you were talking about the kids on, like, you now see even like moms with kids in strollers and they have their iPad. Like, there's just
Right,
kind of like a lack of engagement. And then just kind of the stories about like the YouTube live, and horrible things are happening and crowds are just watching, and they're unaffected. It's like almost like real life isn't happening. They're not present, they're not in the moment. And so it's just like, I just feel like corona is like exacerbating that feeling. And then how do you like come how as a society are we going to come back with what we've been talking, the core of what we're talking about, vulnerability and compassion. Like, I
right,
like, how is society going to remember that compassion? But there's been a lot of beautiful examples, during this period too. I don't want to say it's all bleak,
right,
but I just feel like, in like, when you look at just the microcosms of your life, it's lacking.
right. And I think it's a really important point that you make. When you look at the microcosms, that's where we have to begin this whole reentry process. Is we really have to bring compassion to it, and understanding and patience. None of us have ever been through this before. And various people have different vulnerabilities, right? I'm significantly older than both of you. One of you might have an immune compromised system. We have to go into it knowing that not everybody's going to do it the same way that we think they should do it. Not everybody's going to do it in a uniform way. Some people are going to be reckless about it even.
Yeah.
I think this is a time that it really requires us to be brave and to say, I'm not comfortable with you coming that close, or I notice you don't have a mask on and I would really appreciate if you would put one on, or whatever it is that we're all going to be noticing and paying attention to what's coming up for me as I walk into this, re-enter this space that I used to not give a second thought to. And honor that, really honor what you need in order for your system to feel safe. And it starts with each one of us as an individual. We can then, talk to our families about reentry, being compassionate, being understanding, but really, first and foremost, being okay with saying, this is not okay with me. I'm not comfortable with that, whatever it is that is, because again, we're not wired that way necessarily. We're a very polite culture in general, and we have these feelings, but we don't say it, especially in the workplace or where there's kind of acquaintances versus, close friends, that we'd probably feel a lot more comfortable saying, like, what's wrong with you? Put a mask on,
Right.
or whatever. But we have to really, work that muscle to be able to have a voice about what we're comfortable with and what we're not, and not worry about if somebody else thinks that's kind of nuts. It's just part of what we have to do.
It seems a lot about, and when I talk about grateful goddesses and I talk about our inner self and our inner goddess, it's like tapping into that inner goddess with courage and bravery and acknowledging, naming, communicating.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you all, what is your takeaway from today, from what you've learned from Peggy, what you've learned about yourself?
So there's so much that I could say from the wisdom and the intellect that Peggy offered us. But again, as I will put my vulnerability out there, I've had therapy, and there's been lots of reasons and needs for it, and I believe in it. And to me, it's like a massage. It's just something you do that makes you feel so much better.
So thank you for sharing that.
For me, I think this, in kind of both questions that I asked you, Peggy, I mean, I think that if I were to think about really what I'm taking away, it's kind of having compassion for my fears, compassion for risks that I have not yet taken, would like to take. I think it's just sort of recognizing it, putting them aside, bringing them back out, but really sort of when you sort of take a step back and look and say, and try to understand why it is you're feeling that way. And as you said, Karen, earlier, like bringing it close, and there are times to do that and times when you're not really so prepared to do that. But I think just compassion for these feelings, for these very, very,
Right.
sometimes very difficult feelings that we're having. That's for me, a big takeaway from today.
I'm going to add on to that, that
Okay.
notion of compassion, because on the flip side of that is judgment. And it's really easy, we all have our own lens, and to judge others, interactions, and you don't know what their lens is, and you don't know what they're coming from, and you don't know what's
Right.
brought them there. And I think that, again, and for me, being a highly extroverted person, it's really easy to judge introverted people, to be like, why can't you engage more? Why don't you smile more? Why don't you talk more? And you just gave me a really good reminder that, like, we are all experiencing this very, very differently. And there's so many factors that you can't even count. And going kind of back to the looting and the rioting, and kind of like these conversations with my kids, that yes, it's awful that they're doing this, and I'm so sad for our city, and we're all fearing for our safety. But this is generations of feeling diminished and compromised, and
Right.
it's like tinder, like they're fueled, and we've
Mhm.
all been bottled up, and like we're all so angry about this lifestyle and situation that it's just almost an excuse to erupt. So it's kind of like trying to also teach compassion to our children about what's happening.
Right.
And my takeaway is I'm going to circle back to the beginning. I love The Wizard of Oz. I bring that up a lot because I really do relate to Dorothy and finding her way home. And just with this topic of vulnerability and courage, it just reminds me of the lion and how he just searched and searched for courage, wanted it from the wizard, and the wizard said, "You had it all along." And I feel like
Exactly.
we have it all inside of us, and it's just how are we going to express it? What are we going to do to nurture that? And I think, and I know what you've shared with us today has been ways of nurturing that inner goddess, that courage that's inside of us. So thank you so much, Peggy, for joining us and on this vulnerability, fear, and now transforming into courage episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the conversation. I think these are important conversations, and I really appreciate hearing what each of you was able to take away from this. And
Good.
I love that it includes just this idea of we all have the capacity to be compassionate and understanding of others, but we don't always afford that or gift ourselves with that. And we really all need to be more mindful of that, that we all have different experiences. We've all been on different journeys. And some of us are more vulnerable than others to certain fears. If we can just go into the world with compassion towards self, then it's going to spread to others. So thank you for your thoughtful questions too. I appreciate that.
Peggy, if our listeners want to contact you, how can they do that?
I have a website, which is my name, my first and last name, Peggy, Peggy, Hough, HOUGH.com. So they're welcome to contact me through that. There's an email right within the website. And thank you again for having me, Karen. I appreciate it.
No, my gosh, thank you.
Up next, favorite things. Opening up to happiness and joy.
Here we are talking about our favorite things, either things that bring us joy, comfort. We were talking about vulnerability and fear on this episode, and I actually brought along a photo of me when I was a little
That's
girl.
great.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I am about 3. And this was when I was scared of what was under my bed. And I actually have this photo beside my nightstand. I look at it all the time before I go to sleep, when I wake up, and I tell myself, you are okay. I do.
That's
I
awesome.
say, I'm the mother now, and I look at me when I was 3, and I say, you're okay. There's no monster under your bed. You're going to be okay. And I feel it. So that's what I do, and that's one of my favorite things.
It's your inner
I love
child.
that.
It's my inner child, and now I'm the mother, and I know how to mother, you know, how to care and nurture. So I take care of this little girl that had the crazy hairstyle. I take care of her. So
I'm wearing, I've been wearing this necklace. I wear it all the time. You really can't see it, I know, but it's a lotus flower. And the lotus, it's a flower that, you know, blooms from mud. And so it's like this ugly environment. And so it comes from this really murky, ugly place and then blooms this beautiful flower. And so I just keep it close to my heart. And one of my best friends, Lisa Kendall, it's from her jewelry collection. So
Oh, nice.
it feels good.
that's so nice.
Beautiful.
I don't know if it's quarantine or not, but I have been feeling very dry and chapped. And this is like filled with like peppermint oil and yumminess. And it's like a
Nice.
luxurious chapstick. So this makes me feel really happy when I'm feeling stuck inside. And
Makes you feel
Nice.
happy. I love that.
Okay, so when we all go back to traveling around, this has actually been one of my favorite things pre-pandemic, and everyone in my family made fun of me when I used it, and now all of a sudden I'm the hero with it. But it is, it's called a fly caddy, and what this does, and this is like the craziest thing, but this goes over your seat back, you know, the tray table.
Oh, yeah.
and everyone's going to look at you like, funny, but less so today after the pandemic. And it has these little pockets, and I put my phone in one and my water bottle in the other. And, I still wipe down everything all around me with the wipes and everything, but this goes over, and then it pops back up. If you can see, like, sort of, like, so here, and then you have like these pockets, like for your devices and whatever. And then you just wash it and, use it on the next one. And
I love
so
that.
I
That's
just
very
traveled
cool.
actually
cool.
today, and all of a sudden my husband's not making fun of me anymore for using
Well,
it.
I think it not only makes you feel good, but it makes you feel safe, right? Which is
Exactly.
is important.
And, it keeps everything organized. You feel safe, it's clean. And
I want one.
Yeah.
Hey,
By the
very
way,
cool.
Etsy, one of my favorite sites.
Okay.
To get all
Etsy.
these sort of fun things. Yeah.
So
Excellent.
I asked Peggy to share. She's new to this favorite thing. So what did you bring besides your cute little dog?
That was actually one of my favorite things, and now he has left, but at least you got a glimpse of him.
Yeah.
But that is absolutely one of my favorite things. When you sent me the text, I decided this is where I was going to set up to do my session, because my family's behind me.
Yeah.
And just that we're not always together, and some of them live out of town.
Mm-hmm.
The images of those that I love, I have pictures all around, and that just brings me great joy. It's a way of connecting with them even when I can't be with them. I tell people all the time that when I see my cell phone ring and it's FaceTime with my son, it's just instant joy, because I know my son is not going to FaceTime me, but his 2.5-year-old son will. So
Right.
those are the things that really do bring me joy. And my dog is my kind of constant companion, and he really does bring me tremendous joy.
He's so cute. Thank you again for sharing. Thank you for staying on for Favorite Things.
Unleashed your inner goddess yet? Thanks for joining us today on Grateful Goddesses. We invite you to visit our website, www.gratefulgoddesses.com, to access today's show notes as well as other helpful resources. Don't forget to leave a review. Until next time, stay strong and empowered to be a grateful goddess.